what's the line between like financial therapy and planning or coaching and kind of like, I call what I do coaching or mentoring or planning. The people go, oh, it felt like a therapy session. And I'm like, well, kind of. But where do you see the line?
There's not a line. I think it's more a Venn diagram, right? There's overlap here. But for me, one of the bigger differentiators is therapy is when you're in pain. Coaching is when you're healthy and you can grow. If we use a sports analogy, right? Basketball, I'll just use basketball, right? You have the basketball coach. He coaches the player to dribble the ball, pass, shoot, play the plays. All really important. But what happens after that player goes up for the layup and comes down and rolls his ankle? Does the coach keep working with him? No. He goes to the physical therapist and he goes through his whole rehab exercise. And maybe he's still seeing the coach so he can keep up on what's going on, but he's got to get that ankle rehab. And so I think financial therapy in that way is like, man, I just feel this chronic aching pain around looking at my budget. So maybe they've worked with the coach or the planner and they know like, yeah, we need to do the budget. We understand it. So we understand how a budget works. We know what to do with it. But man, every time I go to talk to my wife about it, it just erupts in a conversation. Okay, well, now that there's something painful going on in there that needs to be addressed before you can move forward with the coaching or advice that you've gotten.
Welcome to the Childfree Wealth Podcast, hosted by Bree and Dr. J, certified financial planner. Here we discuss life and finances as it relates to being child-free. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please consult your advisor before implementing any ideas heard on this podcast.
Hey, Childfree Wealth listeners. I have a really fun discussion we're going to have today with a good friend, Ed Coambs from Healthy Love and Money. And I was on his podcast and we started chatting and like I just loved it. We were getting into this discussion and I'll be honest, Ed and I were nerding out on a whole bunch of like deep psychology thoughts. And if we nerd out today, I apologize. Like that's just kind of how we work. He actually is a financial therapist who works mostly with couples. That's his gig. So we're going to talk about couples, money, how that all comes together, how your past and your attachment issues and all this stuff. Now, if you go, well, we got nerdy and we got little therapy, cool. That's like kind of where we're going to go. And that's what it is. Ed, welcome to the Child Wealth Podcast.
Jay, I really appreciate that introduction. And yeah, I just can't help myself to nerd out. I'm a recovering jock. In high school, if you said, Ed, you're a nerd, I would have been like, what are you talking about? I don't even know. Like, honestly, look, my high school buddies, they were going off to Yale and Cal Berkeley and all these fancy schools. And I was going to the community college to be a firefighter. So like, I have earned my stripes as a nerd in graduate school, catching up. But man, I am passionate about couples and money. It is such an important topic.
Yeah, and it's one of those that every time I work with a couple, I kind of feel, I don't know, lucky that I get to do this and dive in and tell couples that I'll be honest, I'm not always successful. Like I love meeting with couples before they get married, and my success rate's not perfect. Can't always fix everything, but it's amazing to see the shifts you can see in couples. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's so rewarding when they go from frowns and resentment and anxiety to smiling and connection and holding hands. That's, which is really what they want. They want to be connected to each other. They just haven't been able to find their way back to each other.
So let me ask you kind of just a definition question first. And I've had people ask me this question, and I've got my answer, but I want to see yours. Is what's the line between like financial therapy and planning or coaching and kind of like, I call what I do coaching or mentoring or planning. The people go, oh, it felt like a therapy session. And I'm like, well, kind of. But where do you see the line?
There's not a line. I think it's more of a Venn diagram, right? There's overlap here. But for me, one of the bigger differentiators is therapy is when you're in pain. Coaching is when you're healthy and you can grow. So if we use a sports analogy, right? Basketball, I'll just use basketball, right? You have the basketball coach. He coaches the player to dribble the ball, pass, shoot, play the plays. All really important. But what happens after that player goes up for the layup and comes down and rolls his ankle? Does the coach keep working with him? No. He goes to the physical therapist and he goes through his whole rehab exercise. And maybe he's still seeing the coach so he can, keep up on what's going on, but he's got to get that ankle rehabbed. And so I think financial therapy in that way is like, man, I just feel this chronic aching pain around looking at my budget. So maybe they've worked with the coach or the planner and they know like, yeah, we need to do the budget. We understand it. So we understand how a budget works. We know what to do with it. But man, every time I go to talk to my wife about it, it just erupts in a conversation. Okay, well, now that there's something painful going on in there that needs to be addressed before you can move forward with the coaching or advice that you've gotten.
I've been struggling with how to explain this with clients. And the terrible analogy I use is kind of like you get three people in your life. You got somebody look back, somebody look up spiritually, and somebody look forward as a coach. And I tend to be more in that forward looking. I will say though, clients reach out when they're in pain. I mean, they really reach out either when something's going wrong or when something went like amazing. Like either I got like a giant job, a lot of money, or like, oh, something's broken. Well, I had a client the other day ask me, you know, they were explaining their situation, like, hey, do you think I should see a therapist? And we pulled it apart, and there's like, when should you go to a clinical therapist? When to a financial therapist? When to like, I get it. There's not a line, and it is overlapping. But when do you refer people to which?
I think for me, I've gotten comfortable with the fact that there is gray space, right, and that like multiple, I'm using very clinical language, treatments can be helpful. Same presenting problem, couple is struggling to put together their budget. Your coaching process may help alleviate that pain. My therapy approach might alleviate that pain. My therapy approach might not alleviate that pain, and they need more of a coaching orientation, right? So that's the other thing is we want to keep in mind is therapy is good for some things, but not great for others.
Well, and I think part of it's also what you can hear and receive. There are some people, my way of looking at it is if you love either therapy or coaching, you need the other side. It's kind of like the other, you need to lean into whichever side you don't like, because you probably need that. I mean, is that crazy or?
No, I actually think that's really valid. And that's something I've been really leaning and growing into as I spent 10 years deep in the therapy world and learning what does that mean and how do I heal and all that stuff. And there is value in looking backwards. But I also, even yesterday, all wisdom from Facebook, but I had someone saying like, some people just become so addicted to looking backwards and rehashing their trauma and trying to resolve it that they've missed the fact that there's a life ahead of them to live. And I think that that's one of the classic arguments to the backwards looking approach. I try to take a both and or a holistic view is there is probably a period of time where you do need to look backwards and try to make meaning and sense out of your past and work through that to some extent. But you could spend your whole life looking backwards and trying to make meaning and sense and heal from the past and miss the life that's in front of you and where you're trying to go, which is what financial planning is mostly concerned with is how do we get you from here today to 5 years from now and 20 years from now and manage those things. And so that's what's been so refreshing as I've come back to the field of financial planning is we get to look forward. And that's why I like the field of coaching. And I'm learning more and more about that side of things is we can also be just so darn focused on only looking forward that we don't really account for the fact that like, I still have this really great lingering pain around the fact that my mom abandoned me or my dad was an alcoholic or, you fill in the blank painful set of experiences. At some point that stuff will catch up with you.
Well, and when you have a couple, you're bringing two sets of that together. I'm going to come back to that one second, but I want to ask one clarifying question. So you had worked on kind of this certified financial therapist concept and all that. Does that mean you're like a licensed therapist in certain states or kind of like, how does that like, just the mechanics like question on that? Can I use my medical insurance with you?
This is a great question. And there is a bit of an I depends on this, right? So the Financial Therapy Association is a professional organization and it brought together financial planners, licensed mental health professionals, and academics. Now, Jay said this is going to be nerdy, so we're going to be nerdy. There are academics that study financial planning, and there are academics that study therapy and mental health. So really, we have 4 quadrants here. All 4 of these groups of people came together and said, how do we beg, borrow, and steal from each of these places to create something new and special? And we're going to call it financial therapy. So now as the end user, people that are listening, they're probably not trying to be a financial therapist. They're trying to receive, if they wanted to receive financial therapy, they're asking themselves, well, am I seeing a therapist or am I seeing a financial planner or am I seeing both? And That's where it's going to become it depends. Because we have people that come from the field of financial planning and get our certification. And what we would say is, you're going to be working most likely in a financial planning business model, which means your insurance will not be used.
But does that mean they're a therapist?
It means they have therapeutic skills and abilities specific to money. It does not mean they are a licensed mental health professional.
Which are you?
So this is where I get to be really fun, is I have actually gone through the education and certification to be a licensed marriage and family therapist. And I maintain that license in the state of North Carolina. I have also gone through and earned my certified financial planner designation and maintain that with the CFP board. I have both of those designations.
And we'll come back to which hat wins, but that's a separate discussion. Let's go pull into some couples. And one of the ones that I started kind of cluing into, and this is why I wanted to know if you're kind of on the therapy side, the CFP side, like kind of where we fit, is so we come in as a couple together, and one of us grew up in a scarcity mindset. Family was broke, had a lot of trauma around that. And the other one grew up with a bit more money, a bit more safety. And how do we balance those two? I mean, I've seen this often where we get like it's a yin yang, almost like an opposites attract. But then when it comes to, okay, as a couple, what's our money mindset? What's our structure? What's our approach? It becomes a challenge.
Yes. Well, the question is, what are the exercises or activities that we start to do?
Well, how do you approach that? I mean, like, seriously, if I'm a couple and I'm coming, I mean, you're literally coming with almost a different set of language, different set of experiences. I see it, at least when I meet with the couples, and I'm like, you two aren't having even the same discussion because your frame is completely different.
Exactly. And so I think for me, one of the therapy words that I like to use is psychoeducation. They may know that they come from different backgrounds, like at some superficial level. Okay, I grew up more affluent, you grew up in poverty. I get that. But what they don't really get deep enough into is really the empathic understanding of what that experience has been like. A couple that I'm thinking about, she grew up with a single mom, struggling to work. He grew up on the country club. And so she would say, oh, well, life was like a Disneyland for you. And I would watch him just kind of collapse, because what she was failing to appreciate is that while he grew up with greater financial means, there was still emotional deprivation in his family. And this is where a lot of people get things real mixed up, is because you have more financial means does not mean you had a better life. It just means you had more financial resources. Psychological well-being comes out of relational quality, not out of financial standing. Now, does financial standing help improve the chances? Yes, to a degree, but not perfectly. I just said that in a probably a little more professional, because I'm looking at you, Jay, talking about it. But we would talk about it in a more empathic way, and we would be exploring what that looks like. Conversely, the person that grows up on the country club, so to speak, with their spouse, we would be questions about what was that experience like? What happened to you? When do you feel that fear response? I got to talk with Jay, you maybe never heard of this, a death doula.
Yes. We just had somebody actually at a podcast we recorded recently.
Wonderful. She was talking about, that she grew up in poverty. And when they go out to dinner now, she still feels her hand kind of tight and tense when the bill comes up. And she's aware of what that's about. And so she and her husband supportive, so they don't make a huge deal out of it. But they had to really grow through and understand that some of these responses are so deeply embedded into our nervous system that we can't maybe fully let go of it. There's that great country song or saying that you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. To some extent, I wonder if you can take someone out of poverty, but you can't take the poverty fully out of them, and vice versa. You can take someone out of wealth, but you can't fully take the wealth out of them. Those experiences are so deeply embedded in our minds and brains.
Sometimes pulling it apart helps, but sometimes it also picks a scab. I mean, we got to find that balancing act. Carl Richards, if you haven't caught it yet, 50 Fires, he's got a new podcast. He's having a lot of questions on financial planning. And he has a question I really like and have stolen is, what was your first memory with money in your family? And how'd you know what was going on there? Which is a really telling kind of and people can usually tell you exactly, I was at this age, this is when I learned we blank. And it's just an awareness. But then there are times where you ask that question and that answer is hard. It's painful. How do you handle that?
Well, I think, and so that's really the deep roots of psychotherapy and how do we address trauma? And there's loads of different modalities to treating trauma. So some of it is about exposure based, some of it's reflection based, some of it's narrative, some of it is being met with empathic support, some of it's about sitting with different physical exercises. But, in more classic therapy terms, anything that's repressed lives in the subconscious and can still be driving the show. And so that's why we're so focused on going backwards and trying to open those wounds up and get them expressed. The analogy that I sometimes use is just like a surgeon has to create some pain to get to the underlying wound, but they do it skillfully and with intention, and they create an environment for that thing to then heal. Because what we also know about human organisms in general is that they want to be self-healing, right? Our bodies are designed to heal themselves when given the right environment. And the better we understand that, the more we create an environment for our minds to. Our brains are a social organ. They want to be healthy, but they have to be given the right context and relational experiences in order to reorganize the experiences. So if you have that painful first money memory experience, I was working with a client yesterday about this. And this is why I love working with couples, especially. It is because individuals actually don't want to be cared for by their family members, not by the therapist. But they come to the therapist because nobody in their family can care for them in the way that they need to be cared for. So it's not that family members don't care about them, but it's they don't have the relational skills or abilities to care for them in their pain. People end up in therapy because there is nobody else in their life that knows how to walk through that emotional pain with them and to start creating more relief.
That's an interesting. It brings up an interesting question. Somebody asked me. I recently did an episode talking about DIY and finance and all that. And can you do it yourself? Like, can you heal yourself of that trauma, that money hit behaviors, the money habits, whatever you want to call them, of these past, or do you always need someone else to help you?
Here's where I think there's a sweet middle. I think it's both and. I think you are responsible for doing your own work. And ultimately, most money injuries have a relational component. And the way that we heal relational injury is through new, higher quality relationships. Right. So I just had the experience of, and here's where the mistake is. It doesn't have to be a therapist. Therapists are trained to do this and they're usually well equipped, but it can also be really high quality friends or professionals, colleagues. So I was just in a mastermind group recently with some colleagues, and I've been feeling some shame about some money decisions that have been made. And because I'm anticipating judgment and fear, I'm like, I just hold it in. But it's like, these colleagues and friends I know are empathic. I know they're supportive. So I'm going to share this. And they didn't judge me. They just smiled and said, wow, I can see how you feel bad about that. What do you want to do to resolve it? And it was like some of that shame about the decisions that I made that have had some negative consequences relaxed. And so it's like, oh, now I feel more energy to go and solve the problem. For me, why I think empathy and relational bondedness is so important for working through difficult situations, because it's when I'm received and safe, then I can be changed. And we have this massive culture of, you got to challenge them, you got to push them, you got to stress them for change. That's not how I understand how people grow and change.
Well, and I'm going to challenge you a little bit. And by the way, Ed and I had literally met yesterday, and we've met before, and like we get super nerdy on this stuff. Like, you all are getting to listen into like the high level stuff. I look at things through a learning lens. You look through a more therapy lens, and I'm saying, okay, if I have a psychologically safe environment for learning, it's okay to push them. And I
Yes.
literally will use their change of body state as a way to. I am one of those, and the way I explain it is, I'm always going to make a psychologically safe environment for learning. And then I'm going to take turns between patting you on the back and kicking you in the butt. There's kind of like that push and pull. I'm more direct than most. And I tell that to my clients. And if you don't like that, I apologize. That's just my style.
Right.
But I do it in a safe learning environment. And there's a balancing act there.
There is a balancing act there. And if we can even just use our own relationship, right? We're just getting to know each other, relatively speaking, but becoming fast friends. And I was discussing some concerns I have about my fee, right? And you were pushing on me, and I felt it, but you were pushing with care and genuine concern to get me to the other side of like, and I see Ed's distressed about this. Let's help him think through what he really wants and where he wants to land. I squirmed out of it and you didn't chase me down, but I came back around and we had the conversation and said, Jay, I actually thought about it more. I talked to a couple other people. Here's where I landed. And then I think this is teachers and therapists and coaches are all using relational rapport, if you will, to affect change. And it is this balancing act of when to push and when to support, when to encourage, when to cry with, if you will, not literally, but and that's where it takes being a really dynamic person to navigate that. And it's an art. There's the science, right? Understanding what happens in the hippocampus and the amygdala and the brainstem, blah, 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 blah. But like, how do I apply that in real time motion with the person that's sitting across from me?
Well, and also, what is your goal? When I'm working with a couple or anyone I'm working on a planning standpoint, my goal is for them to figure out what life they want to live and then figure out how to get there. Finances are kind of like a kind of excuse to get there. Like, I mean, there's steps, but there's a lot of baggage that comes with it. And because I work solely with child-free folks, we often struggle with scripting. What was the script you were raised with? What was the, what we call the standard life script that says you must do? What is the good boy, good girl thing? And
100%.
and all time I have to go, listen, you took a hard right turn off the standard life script. Don't go back unless you want to. And like a great example is I fight all the time with people on buying a house. If you're going to be a nomad and you're going to move every 2 years, buying a house makes no sense. They're like, but my family says I must do this or else I'll always be broke. And I'm like, so all these scripts get written in my words, I talk about mental models and how that works, but they get written in and saying, okay, you must do these things. And when we bring couples together, we actually have two different scripts. And by the way, my couples have left the standard script. So It's kind of like, what happens when you don't have one? And that's, by the way, that's the meat. Like, that's the fun stuff to dig into, but like, it's a challenge.
100%. And I love that language because I think it's so relatable, is the standard life script. And what I start to talk to my couples about is what's the story that you want to create together. But it's just even getting them to accept intellectually that they have a story going on in their head is a journey for some folks. They're not even aware that they have a story going on in their head and that story could change. Like, so these are stages of growth and change, even is becoming aware that one, you have a story in your head. Two, this is where it does tie back a little bit, is like, well, what did you see in the past that created the story in your head? This is why I love Bruce Perry and Oprah's book, What Happened to You, not What's Wrong with You, right? Because we're in this mindset of what's wrong with you. Wrong question to ask. What have you experienced? Because what you experience sets expectations, unavoidable. Dogs bite you. How do you feel about dogs? Depends. If you had someone lovingly show up after the dog bite and say, wow, Johnny, Ed, I can see how that really hurt. That was scary. Let's get that taken care of. Not all dogs are like that. Here's how to know when a dog is going to bite you. Let's go pet some other dogs so you can see that dogs are friendly. There's probably a good chance that you're going to enjoy dogs later in your life. Versus, what the hell were you doing, Ed? Why were you so close to that dog? They were going to bite you. That was stupid. Oh, you're bleeding? Get over it. Yeah, probably not going to love dogs.
Well, and you don't even think about that moment years later.
Oh, that's where the irrational fears come from, is that you've forgotten that you had that dog bite experience. But let's stop using dog bite experiences and let's talk about money experiences that are painful for kids before they're verbal. Hand smacked in the grocery store. Don't buy that. Oh, I want this thing. It costs $500. The parent says, you're crazy. We can't afford that. Meanwhile, the kid can't even count to 10 yet. They have no concept about how number works, but what they do know is emotion. And they feel the anger and the disgust and the rage of the parent. This is why parents are so responsible for their emotional reaction. Now, I realize I'm on the Childfree Wealth podcast, so you don't have kids, but you were a child to parent. You were kids to parents who had emotional reactions to money. And by the way, it's not possible to be fully emotionally neutral, even if you think you are.
This brings up to kind of like a big one I've been having a discussion. We talked about this in the podcast recently, and Bree actually used an example, control issues. Her and her spouse were fighting over chicken nuggets. It was a $7 expense. Like, I got a text from Bree that, like, we're getting divorced. It's coming to an end. Like, I need your help. I'm like, I'll Venmo you the $7. Okay. Like, seriously. But we see these things as couples, like this one issue or whatever. And by the way, with money, my argument's it's almost always a symptom, not the actual disease. It's not about the chicken nuggets, but we get these control issues that are based on lack of control or what are we raised of the structure. And we have two different areas. And I've been working with, I have quite a few couples I'm working with on these issues right now. And sometimes we pull apart where it's been. Sometimes that's personal work that needs to get done. Sometimes it's like we need dynamics of the couple. We need guidelines. We need structure. But that control issue in money is so big in couples. How do you peel back that onion? Because I mean, it really is.
Man, how many hours do we have to spend together? I think I have my methods and I'm always trying to evolve them. Do you think, I want to say this with sensitivity to the audience, is for me, raising kids is teaching me a lot about how control issues really come into play, right? Because control is psychologically a good thing, right? We need to be able to control our environment, possessiveness for psychological health. We need to have a sense of ownership over things. The challenge is when it becomes distorted too strong one way or the other. We have to control everything or we control nothing. And the experiences that we're having in our childhood are setting that template. And so that's what we're working on, is what happened in childhood around being able to control and influence your environment developmentally. What did you learn about sharing? Was it required? Was it discouraged? What happened for you there? So we can start asking reflective, what messages did you learn about sharing? What did you learn about having things taken from you without being asked? Especially because what's unique about childhood development is developmental capacities change so rapidly in childhood. Jay, you and I are 3 years apart in age, I think, from a past conversation, but we probably feel developmentally pretty close.
You're technically a millennial, but we won't hold that against you. I'm Gen X, but no. You're like on the 1 year difference, but no.
Yeah, I do have the bald spot for that, so I'm good. But right, the difference between a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, the difference between a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old is significant, but they don't have the developmental capacity to recognize that differential. So now you have siblings that are able to overpower younger siblings. How do parents manage that? I mean, there's books and books written about it, right?
But what happens though? Let's pull it back though. So now I'm a couple, I'm 30, 40 years old, and these patterns are already built in me. I can't change that, or can I?
Well, this is where we turn back to neuroscience. So this is why, like, I never thought that I would be studying the brain as intensely as I have in order to do the work that I'm doing, right? I started from, let me learn how money works technically and become a financial planner. Then I moved to a seminary and became a therapist, which was more about how the mind and family dynamics work and somewhat philosophy and theology. And like, we should look to that to guide us. And then, found the holes and gaps in that. And well, where do we go? We're like, oh, hello, you have this whole organ called a brain. How does that brain actually work? What's the science say about how our brain works? Oh, good news. The brain's neural patterns can change and evolve over time. But there's all these axons and dendrites that are interconnected that create neural pathways. And yes, those are primary patterns. They become like superhighways for us. But just like if we start doing bicep curls, we develop the muscle. If we start to entertain new experiences, and new experiences are like bicep curls. So if you have experience of giving and taking, I'm actually reading a book. I wish I knew the author's name off the top of my head. She's a chiropractor turned sex therapist. Wrap your head around that one. And her book is called Give and Take. And it's an incredible book, but it's all about just the process of giving something to someone and seeing what that's like, receiving it. And it's creating corrective experiences. What's it like to receive something when someone gives you something? Because there's so many people that have trouble receiving things too. And so with our money life, we're in this constant give and take process. What does it feel like to be touched, to be seen in this giving and taking of resources? What's mine? What's yours? This is why we get in all these arguments about, well, how should you set up the checking accounts? What's the one right way to set up the checking accounts for the family? Newsflash, there ain't one. It doesn't matter how you set those accounts up. You still have the same problem of figuring out give and take.
Well, it's the question of communication. Are we all on the same plan or not? I don't care that it counts. Are we all on the same page? I think what I see is this control issue comes out the first time we're really trying to manage money together. Which, by the way, we could have been married 10 years and not really done it together. We could have just been roommates paying bills together. I've been working on this with a few different couples at this time, and I've come to the conclusion at times the kind of steps to it is to figure out which areas do each of the people have to control for a reason. And then is there an area they can give up control? And can we make a dance between what are we controlling now? I had a couple really interesting, gave me language I liked around it. They use the terms high preference, low preference, no preference.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
I'm going out to dinner. I have a high preference. I want Mexican food tonight. Cool. Unless I really have a high preference today, let's go. And it's just a good language of saying, this is something I really, for whatever reason today, this issue, I just, and it gives people a language around it while they're trying to figure out the dance of control together.
Which I think then I want to ask that deep, what's the point of having money? And people can answer this however they want, but in my book, it's about creating shared meaning and purpose together in your life while respecting autonomy. And being able to hold those two things is an act of maturity. But we usually end up over favoring one or the other, acquiescing, well, whatever you want, which then leads to financial resentment.
Or scorekeeping. That's the other one I worry about.
Well, scorekeeping is the behavioral pattern of emotional resentment, right? I feel resent, so now I'm starting to keep score. And I'm going to balance the deck somehow. And I may or may not tell you. And there's a lot of different levers people can pull financially to do that.
Well, not only financial.
Oh, yeah. Let's bring in sex life and kids and other things. Oh, yeah.
And that's why I'm arguing, hey, you two need to figure out what is your control paradigm. For example, I love when I make budgets to set up pocket money. This is your money to spend however you want. I don't get to say anything about it. It's not an allowance because that's a different thing.
Oh, that has a very different.
But it is, we each have X to spend that the other one gets to say nothing. It's a way to give you back some control, but to be within a budget. There's ways to find that balance while you're working on the bigger issues. It's kind of like the 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And you might find that, so-and-so wants control of the TV, but will give up control of something else. And that's okay. I just don't want to be a scorecard.
No. Well, because you end up, when you take them through the exercise of trying to actually keep score, you realize how insane it becomes and how ridiculous. It just becomes an impossible task. And, I think if I haven't said this yet, I think the words that I like to introduce to my couples is we're working towards building financial intimacy. And intimacy is the experience of being vulnerable and being known, also of being accepted for all of who you are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this is not a permission to act out all the ugly and bad, but there is a responsibility to that as well. Marriage is ultimately one of the greatest acts of maturity, and yet we find ourselves acting in some of the most immature ways.
Now, keep in mind, many of my clients are in long-term relationships and not marriage either, which brings its own weird financial things to it.
Which sets different parameters and expectations. And so those are all at play.
The basics are still the same, the intimacy, the discussions, all that. I don't care whether you have a legal piece of paper. I mean, that's not, if you don't have that, we just have to make sure your wills and power of attorney is in place. We'll take care of it legally a different way. Right. But I think the challenge is, and I like working with couples. If I have my choice, I want to work with you before you get long-term commitment, whatever that means, married, whatever it is, because I think that's the time to work on it. I'll work on it later, but the best time is before you're making, a commitment, whether it's buying a house together, you're getting married, you're deciding, hey, we're going to be in this together for years, whatever it is. And money's tough. I mean, I do believe, and I want to check with you, but there are some times where you might not be able to come together. Now, I've said this about, I've kind of looked at this in some cases, and I've seen couples turn it around, but there are just you may not be able to do the work individually and as a couple in a reasonable enough time frame to make this work. Is that fair?
Yes, right. I mean, this is depending on how far down the rabbit hole you are and how open you are to working on it will determine on whether it's recoverable or salvageable. And sometimes couples can get to a place where there's an irreconcilable difference, and we just accept that and we name it as what, and then we figure out our accommodations around it. But there are certain things where it's just hard no. You want to keep spending money on hookers, hard no for me, right? You want to go and be a bass fisherman. Okay, I don't love that you spend money to be a bass fisherman, but as long as you don't spend more than $30,000 a year, 10,000, whatever the number is, it doesn't matter. Great. That's the autonomy piece, right? Is like, I want you to be able to do things that are interesting to you, even if it makes absolutely no sense to me and it feels like a colossal waste of money. But there are certain values, places at which you also have a right to draw a line and say, I just can't get over you spending $10,000 a year in sports gambling. And yeah, we could try to work in therapy for years to get you comfortable with that or for them to stop. But if they really don't want to stop sports gambling because it's part of who they are and their identity, right? Because this is that blending of like, the way we spend money is an expression of who we are as a person. It's an expression of our identity. And so if we're not wanting to change some part of who we are and how we see ourselves in the world, good luck.
I know we're being kind of clinical about it rather than about a love line, or whatever it is. But the bottom line, it is an Excel spreadsheet at some point and some numbers, and like there is a component at some point.
Almost all of us live in some level of absolute dollar terms. And it's distorted thinking to think like, oh yeah, well, I could be making $5 million a year. Well, yeah, but you're not. You're making $150,000 a year. And so unless you choose to live within that reality at some point, you're going to face real consequences. And this is, where we really get into distorted, fantastical thinking. Entrepreneurs are infamous for it and run themselves into all kinds of money problems in their relationships because they can't sort out what they aspirationally want to accomplish and what they're actually realistically accomplishing. And then they compound their problems with secrecy, lying, and hiding. And then the spouse finds out and it's mayhem for a while.
Well, yeah, we'll have a whole separate discussion on financial infidelity, but we'll run out of time on that one. Well, but let me go back to your fantastical thinking. I give you the magic wand. What is the one advice you would give a couple, or like one like magical thing you would change about couples?
I am so passionate about people knowing about attachment styles and attachment history. And look, let me disclose, I didn't love learning what this all meant because it meant I had to look at how my family shaped me, and I didn't love that idea. But it, for me, has been one of the most liberating pieces of psychology, is to really understand and make sense out of like, oh, this is why I'm this way. Okay, this makes sense. And now I know how to work with it. And like, oh, I now know I'm acting out my anxious attachment patterns with my wife. Right. So for me personally, it has been one of the most liberating pieces of psychology, is to understand why I do the relational dance that I do. And I think the science is pretty darn solid on it. And it's been around for 80 years. So this is not just Ed's idea about how human relationships work, which is a really great thing. But this is a community of social scientists, psychologists, developmental scientists that have all been studying this for a very long time. Can you poke some holes in it? Of course you can. Is it the end-all key that unlocks absolutely everything? Hell no. Excuse my language. But it's a major piece of the puzzle in my mind.
So attachment theory, and I know that's in your book, and there's different things. So tell us how we find you, and if we want to kind of get to know you, read more about it, listen to you, where do we find you?
Yeah, I would start at the hub of healthyloveandmoney.com. From there, you can learn about my financial planning work, my book, my course. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn at Healthy Love and Money. So that ought to cover the bases pretty good.
That works. And Ed, you and I could talk for hours. We've already proven that offline. So we will take it there. But I think if I took anything out of this, is really, as a couple, we need to have the conversations. We need to be talking about it. We need to be digging in, and need to know when we need to ask for help. Like, I mean, that's big.
sometimes you don't know the questions you need to ask or how to ask them. And sometimes you need that safe and neutral place to land to work through it, because you already know when you ask that question, it's going to be difficult. And
Yeah,
so,
I'll say all the time, investing is really easy. It's all the other things. And somebody explained to me as the unknown unknowns. And I was like, ooh, I like that. And that's where you need somebody as skilled to dig in. But
well, what I want to add is, for most couples, they're living one life through one lens of marriage, and they have their family's frame of reference about what marriage should be like. And they have some broader like media images about what marriage is about. But what they don't have is a professional that has worked with hundreds of couples and has studied the science and the literature on it. And they do have above average grasp on the nature of marriage and how it goes down and what you can do about it. And so finding someone that really has that experience and perspective, and that financial planners have hundreds of use cases of working with couples, so they can give you a much broader perspective of what's normal, what's healthy, what's unhealthy, and provide that guidance. So that's where the value of the professional really comes into play. Is
you're 100% right, and I can't agree with you more. I started doing some analysis of why a lot of my introductory meetings with people ended up in tears, and the end result was because they felt like they were heard, because I've seen people like them. Because I only work with child-free folks. The only parents I take on are their parents. This is who I work with, and it's who I see, and I get to see hundreds of people in a year even, and I study it and I get it. I can tell them where they're going to end up. Like, I can go, hey, you are here. You're going to look just like Joe and Jane in 6 years. Like, I've seen this story. I know how it plays out. And they'll often question me like, really? And I'm like, no, really. You're normal for who I serve. You may be abnormal in the bigger picture, but you're normal in this group. And being able to have that conversation and say, watch out for this. This is where it's going. I can see the pattern. You need help here. And people go, well, but financial planners, they're just doing investment. No, investment is the smallest part of what I do. Like, I mean, that is like, the point something or another of the time I do, but it's so much more. And I don't know. That's maybe you and I will spend the rest of our life out there talking to people and saying, hey, there's so much more to finance, so much more you can learn and grow than what's in your stock account.
one very small piece of the pie. And yes, I think that fundamental human need of knowing I'm not alone in this. And I'm not, like, we have a need to be unique, but we're not so unique. Like, there are very common patterns that people live through. And when you work with a particular group of people, you get to know those patterns very well. And it becomes relatively predictable. And that's what allows you to do your job and allows me to do my job. It's not because I'm some superhuman. It's because I've studied the patterns of a particular group of people and the way they relate. And so you can't see them, but I've studied them and I've seen them and I've seen the journey. So, yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ed, and great to have you.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate the opportunity to be a guest.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a rating or review. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Follow Childfree Wealth on social media or email us at podcast@childfreewealth.com. If you're interested in working together, learn more by visiting our website, www.childfreewealth.com. We'll see you next time.